Hi, I'm Lisa Fletcher, and you're in The Stream. Today, is it time to move beyond the battle of the sexes, or has the war just begun? We look at the so-called end of men. Malika Bilal, our digital producer, is watching out for all your live feedback. Malika, the battle of the sexes is an age-old and controversial debate. How's it playing out online today?
It is, and so we posed the question to our community, what would the end of men look like? We got responses from all over the world, and here's one from London. Graham tweets, this is an interesting question. I like to think that women have to outperform men just to get a job to start with. So we'll pose that question to our guests today, but if you'd like to answer it or chime in, join the conversation with the hashtag AJStream.
And joining us at the table is Hannah Rosen, a senior editor at Atlantic Magazine and author of the controversial book, The End of Men and the Rise of Women. Hannah, welcome to the stream.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
A discussion of gender roles typically makes for lively discussion, and we'll be looking to our community to pitch in on Google+. You're going to get to meet them in just a moment. But first, here's what some of the folks in our stream community are already saying about the end of men.
This isn't really a tragedy. Men have had it pretty good for about 10,000 years. It's good that we're having this discussion, but not time to break out the sad, sad violence.
That the battle of the sexes has become more of a battle of statistics, and it's all a matter of picking and choosing.
Why does it have to be the end of men? Why can it not be the cooperation of men and women?
Until women have an equal say in how our country is run, I'm not going to waste too many tears over the so-called end of men.
I will take your call. I will listen to your opinion of my friends. I will listen to your friends' opinions of my friends. I will be civil to your mother. I will put the seat down. I will separate the recycling. I will carry your lip balm. I will watch your vampire TV shows with you. I will take my socks off before getting into bed. I will put my underwear in the basket. And because I do this, I will drive the car I want to drive. Man's last stand.
I laugh every time I see that. That clip was made for the Super Bowl, which is the American Football Championship, and it's the biggest night of the year for advertisers. It depicts American men as a little emasculated. It is satirical for sure. But is there some truth to it? The End of Men and the Rise of Women argues women are outperforming men at work and school and adjusting better and faster to the changing demands of the post-industrial world. It also notes that as men are falling further and further behind, they are losing their breadwinner status, and with it, their traditional identity. So, are we witnessing the end of men? Joining us now via Skype to discuss this is Stephanie Kuntz, who critiqued The End of Men for the New York Times. She also teaches history and family studies at Evergreen State College in Olympia. And of course, we have the author at the center of it all, Hannah. So, is this the end of men? I mean, are we not seeing the same traditional male power struggle that we've always seen?
We are seeing a struggle. I mean, there's a struggle at every level of society. Many of the measures that I mentioned in the book, women adapting to the new economy, getting more college degrees, those things are happening in great numbers. But, you know, we all live on this planet, and we know, for example, one of your viewers mentioned at the top, which is something I talk about in the book. What happens at the top? Why aren't there more women at the top? And I talk about that. Are we really comfortable with female power when it really comes down to it? Because here we are in Washington, D.C., and, you know, we can talk about why aren't there more women legislators and why aren't there more women CEOs? And that's all a legitimate question.
Obviously, it's a very provocative title, The End of Men. Do you really believe that it is the end of men?
I believe that we're headed in that direction. I mean, I believe if you look at the numbers creatively and you start to think about where we're headed and how women are doing better, you can mostly I'm trying to provoke people to think about things in a different way than they've always thought about them, to consider the possibility that we are in an era where men are the ones who are hampered by their sort of narrowness, one could say, or these ways of being a man, and women less so, that women have been more adaptable and more flexible over the course of the century.
Stephanie, you've been critical of Hannah's book. Do you think that the decline of men is a myth?
Well, I think that it's greatly exaggerated. In the first place, it's exaggerated for better and for worse. In the first place, it's certainly not the end of men. Men earn more at every occupational level and at every educational level. More women have climbed into the upper occupations, but women are also more likely to be poor than men. So there's a lot of ways to go before we have equality. The other side of it, I think Hannah is underestimating the real flexibility of men who have been moving doing very much to catch up. I don't think you can project. We have undergone, Hannah and I completely agree, a revolution in the last 50 years. It is the end of traditional supports for male dominance. You can no longer, if you're a man, there are no longer head and master laws that give you the final say in the home. And there are all sorts of options for women if they don't like the way they're being treated, either at home or at work. So we are reaching a situation where men and women really have to learn to cooperate. I am less optimistic or pessimistic that women will take over and drive men out, and I am more optimistic about men's ability to adapt because I've seen some real changes in them. I don't necessarily think they're less flexible than women. I think they had less incentive to adapt, and they've had to catch up.
Well, as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, we did post this question, what would the end of men look like? Another response from Twitter is Miriam, who says, the end of men would mean not having to count what number of women are accomplishing things. I guess that's a hint towards the stats. But I'd like to go to our Google Plus Hangout now, where Noah Brand is the editor-in-chief of the Good Men Project. And Noah, you wrote in a recent piece that the roles we have been taught to play are inadequate to the lives we live. What did you mean by that?
Back when feminism was still being called women's lib, plenty of people wrote articles about the end of women, about how are women supposed to know what their roles in life are if they're not automatically shuttled into being housewives. And ultimately we're just seeing the same thing here on a rather long time delay. If we're not breadwinners, what are we? Anything we want to be. That's what I was getting at. We're not seeing the end of men. We're seeing a move towards gender parity that is giving rise to the liberation of men. Because if you don't want to be a breadwinner, for decades you've been made fun of, you've been told you're not a real man. And now men are spending more time with their families. Men are getting closer to their children. Ms. Kuntz cited a number of statistics indicating that. I can't see that as a negative thing. I can't see more roles for men as a loss.
But Hannah, aren't there a number of men who are just sort of stuck? I mean, they're stuck in this traditional gender identity role, and then when that goes away, they really don't. And you talk about it in your book. They don't know what to do with themselves.
Right. I mean, towards the end of the book, I get a lot more hopeful, basically saying that vision, like, what do I want after the end of men? It's not to send all the men to the moon. I think a lot of what I'm describing about the end of men is actually not good. Like, you don't want a situation in which men are stuck and women are raising families by themselves. Now, what you do want is, take my own son. I've said this before. If when he grows up, he can have more options in his life. He can work 4 days a week or be at the park with his kids on a weekday, and nobody looks at him and thinks, what's wrong with him? Does he not have a job? Like, no one has any of those thoughts. That's the best possible outcome out of all of this.
But I guess the question then becomes how or who does the shifting? How do we, as a community and as a nation, shift to where it's acceptable for men to do that and not be essentially made fun of?
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't want to pin this all on the men, because it's also we women who have certain expectations of men, and there are societal expectations of men. I mean,
we're confused about what we want, aren't we?
Yes, we are absolutely confused about what we want. And, for example, I looked over the history of the American sitcom on TV, and you look at the men, whenever you put a man in a domesticated situation, we portray him as kind of a buffoon or emasculated or an idiot or messing things up. There's a way in which we feel weirdly threatened by that idea, or we don't really want to get our heads around it. And I think for women, the equivalent is kind of aggression or dominance, or the way in which we have a problem and we punish women if they behave in a certain aggressive way.
Well, I'd like to go to another tweet here. This is from Mei Z Lim, who says, there's no way that the end of men is coming. Women are only starting to catch up. We're still a far cry from an egalitarian society. While we ponder that, let's go to Google Plus, where Christina Patterson is waiting. She's a writer and columnist for The Independent. Christina, go ahead.
Hello. Well, I think when Hannah has talked about the demise of men, I think she's very much talking about a working class phenomenon which has got a lot to do with the end of manufacturing and the end of traditional roles for men in many societies. And certainly that is an issue, and it's an issue where women have come to take the primary roles, and many of them are in bringing their children up in single parent households. But I think amongst the middle class, this is simply ridiculous. If you look at newspapers, if you look at most businesses, if you look at the media, if you look at law, if you look at medicine, if you look at all the primary professions, the people in power are men. And this is not going to change in the next few years. I wish it was, but there is absolutely no evidence to indicate it is. And I think, it's one thing to highlight a phenomenon that affects certain tranches of Western cultures, but to suggest that this is some kind of tipping point for Western culture as a whole is simply ridiculous.
Hannah?
So I think that it's not true that this is just an argument about the working class. If you take young people, for example, and you look at the way I write a lot about, women in their 20s and how well they're doing and how they tend to have more college degrees and how at the point of marriage, women these days all over the world are doing what demographers call marrying down, meaning marrying by necessity men who have lesser prospects than they do. So I think it's not just one of these narrow manufacturing class things. I think, people have shifted drastically. And as Stephanie mentioned, sort of what we expect of fathers, what we expect men to do in the home, sort of the professions that women are entering. It's not just a sort of manufacturing class argument. I think things are shifting. That doesn't mean that the top has completely turned upside down. I mean, this has been happening for 40 years, but
what is it about the post-industrial age that you think makes it more suitable for women?
A few things. I mean, the manufacturing era is where it starts. So we used to value that, and now I don't think men have any particular advantage over women. We're in an intelligence information economy, also a service economy. So a lot of the jobs that are opening, while they're not high-paying jobs, are jobs that have to do with healthcare and nursing and service. All the kinds of things that essentially wives used to do for free are jobs that are now open to women. And the creative economy. So women entering law school, or in England, for example, they talk about the feminization of the medical profession because so many more women are in medical school. So there are different professions. It happens unevenly, but different places where women enter.
Well, Stephanie, there's a question here for you from Pasha, who says the fact that metropolitan areas of the U.S. are getting better for women does not mean anything for women in other parts of the world. Would you care to give us your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that's the problem with the hyperbole in the title. The good part of Hannah's title is that it is provocative. It makes people start to think. But then I think you have to back off of this. There are, countries all around the world where women are still stuck in abusive situations, have very few rights. Here in the United States, even where women are getting more education, they seem to be training themselves, and in this sense, they're not actually more flexible than men in many ways, into occupations and levels of occupations that actually pay less. So we're seeing a big problem for both men and women to come to terms all around the world to come to terms with this, and we certainly have not seen the end of either male privilege and its all accumulated advantages over the year, or in many countries outright male dominance and patriarchy. We do, and here's the important kernel in here that we really should focus on, despite any disagreements we have about the outside of it, and that is that for the first time in history, men and women are really entering the modern workforce with more and more legal rights and more equal opportunities. And I'm not sure that, for me, what I see is a real problem for men and women with the class divergence, the hollowing out of middle class occupations. Yes, it's absolutely true that the loss of manufacturing poses men in particular with a problem because that's where their whole masculine identity used to be. On the other hand, we're not seeing women at the bottom do particularly well either. Some of them are also showing the same lack of adaptation by just going around and thinking that maybe if they get a good relationship or if they become a mother, they will meet the unsatisfied needs in an increasingly complex and unequal society. So I think that men and women face the same issues, and that is to catch up with a world in which our relations are still gradually changing, and they've changed in a revolutionary way in terms of much more equality than in the past. But you would never say, for example, that because we have a black president and that blacks have increased their representation in the upper incomes of America, that we're seeing the rise of blacks and the ends of whites. And I think that we have to be careful when we say that about men and women too.
Well, earlier we mentioned class, and now you just mentioned race. And with that, I'd like to go to Carlos Gomez in our hangout. Carlos, you wrote the book Man Up, and I'd like your thoughts on how does race play into this?
I think it's really important, any discussion we're talking about the whole issue of the decline of men or the he session or all these different things, especially when you talk about men of color and how many men in their prime years of employment and also being parents, especially black and Latino men in the United States, being trapped in the criminal justice system or not being able to seek stable employment because of a criminal record or something like that. You look at the prison boom of the 1980s and even up to now, there's still so many draconian laws that are in place for nonviolent offenses that particularly men of color are disproportionately affected by. And I think that plays a big role in a lot of people growing up in single-parent households or men not being around or visible in those communities in the kind of productive roles or self-sustaining roles that you'd hope to see them in. That was the first point I wanted to make just with that. But also, I think just in general, I think it's interesting to me the idea of shifting gender roles between men and women, and I always find it a little bit funny or a little bit silly that anytime we engage a discussion talking about this, every show I've been on with this, it's always framed about a men versus women type of scenario, and which is something that I don't think it's that at all. I think a lot of this asking questions about things shifting is really more about the end of gender binaries and more fluidity about the roles that we play, and I think that's a positive thing for all of us.
But would you argue that the end of gender binaries has pretty much always existed for women? I mean, women have been historically juggling all sorts of jobs while managing a family and a career and a household. And
Not always, but I would say that, if you look at the course of the century, women have been breaking those down. So things that used to be really unacceptable, even wearing pants or, going to work at all or working while married, like those things have broken down slowly. And I think maybe then the answer is it's time to start breaking them down for men a little bit. That's sort of where I end the book, that maybe it's time, and I know Carlos Gomez writes about this too, maybe it's time to think about the restrictions that we put on men and whether we need to have those as much as we do.
There's a Facebook comment here that from a person that agrees with you. Heather Roberts says, women rule the roast. Society knows it. Men know it. That's why they oppress us. In the UK, women get paid 25% less than men. Men get to glare at our topless images on page 3, and they try to control our reproductive rights. We're blamed for being working mothers, single mothers, or choosing not to be mothers.
This also raises the issue of, has this become too much for women? I mean, we're talking about women in the modern age who are having very influential careers. They're typically running the family finances and the home, and they're still the cooks and the cleaners and the taxi cab drivers. Could this be the end of women? I mean, there's never any ceding of responsibility. It seems like women are always taking on more and more and more. Is there a point where this burden becomes too much?
Yeah, I mean, the book is not that triumphalist. Like, you'll read a lot of these stories and think, I'm not sure I want that life. I mean, even for the women at the top, say, who are lawyers, who I profile, they are doing too much. I mean, they don't give up the domestic sphere, but they seem to be, working a lot more than they used to. Now, men are helping out more than they used to, but women still tend to take control of those spheres. And, evidence does not show that women are happier than they used to be, for example, than they were in the 70s. So I do think there's a way in which women take on too much, which brings us back to, how do you loosen that up? A lot of the way you loosen that up is by letting men change a little bit what they do.
Stephanie, you want to jump in?
I think we go back to a point Hannah made earlier, and that is that both genders are having a tough time getting rid of the old tapes that we've been socialized to hear in our heads, so that many men do find it difficult to let go of the breadwinning identity, or the idea that somehow their identity is based upon earning more than a woman or knowing more than a woman, which is increasingly unlikely, especially in terms of the knowing and the education. But at the same time, women need to let go too. One of the reasons we do too much is that we still have these voices in our head saying, you're the only one who can do the housework, you're the only one who can take care of the kids. And we do what sociologists call gatekeeping, where the man, we say we want the man to be involved, but then we criticize what he's doing or how he's doing it because it's different than us. So this revolution, and I will call it a revolution, I don't think it's an overturning yet in any way, but this revolution toward real equality and the progress we've made in this challenges both men and women in really fundamental ways to rethink the way we get our identity. And one of the big steps forward for women was when you stop feeling to have to prove all the time that we can act like a lady, that we can be feminine. And I think Hannah's quite right, that men need to also reject that idea that they have to be like a man all the time, whatever that means.
Well, there's one follow-up from Christina in our Google Plus Hangout. Go ahead, Christina.
Hello, yes. Well, one thing, I think things will be more equal when women are not judged so much by their appearance. I think women throughout the world can only be fantastically depressed by what's happened in relation to this whole thing in the last 20 or 30 years. The feminists of the 70s thought things were going to get better. They're not. They're getting worse. We're judged by our appearance more than ever. Women are more and more having plastic surgery. They're judged on their weight. They're judged on their hair. Women on reading the news are not allowed to have grey hair. They're not allowed to have wrinkles. Men, certainly in this country, I don't know so much in the US, can have grey hair and wrinkles, and it's absolutely fine. And I think while this ageism hits women, there's just no chance of any kind of gender equality. And I think this is one of the most depressing aspects of the whole argument.
It's a pretty bleak outlook. No chance?
No, I mean, I think the great thing that's happened in the last 10 or 15 years is that men are now increasingly judged by their appearance, and, you know, the number of male grooming products and, you know, shaving and all the things that men now have to do that really, they didn't even have to think about those things, you know, 10 or 15 years ago. So there's been a rise in the kind of male self-care, grooming, specialty stores. I mean, we judge men more and more on those same terms as well.
So we've got about 45 seconds left in the show. What does the new man look like from your perspective?
I think the new man just has a lot of options, basically, the way the woman does. So the new man can do lots of different things and not feel like it's impinging on his manhood. If the new man loses his job, for example, he doesn't have to take on the extra burden of, I'm less of a man. He just has to take on the burden that a woman would. This is terrible. I've lost my job. You know, what am I going to do and who's going to help me? So the new man can ask for help. I mean, there's a lot of things that a new man can do, which makes his life easier and not harder.
All right. Hannah and Stephanie, we're going to continue this conversation in our online post show. But first, here's Malika with some other stories we're following.
A secret recording of New York police stopping a local teenager for, quote, looking suspicious is gaining traction and reaction online. The audio, obtained by the Nation website, was recorded by 17-year-old Alvin, who was questioned by two officers using racially charged language. Listen as Alvin explains.
Cop car went past me. A couple of seconds later, I heard the car turn around, and they just popped out. They just all jumped out the car. I decided to record it because I was getting stopped a lot, and I didn't have evidence of a cop being disrespectful or anything, so I pressed the button and recorded the whole thing.
In the recording, which we're not playing because of its offensive language, the police threatened to punch Alvin. They also say they will arrest him for being a mutt, a derogatory term for a person of mixed heritage. Well, the police practice of stopping someone on the street is known as stop and frisk, and it sparked anger online. I wonder if the most privileged people in this country had the same things happening to their children. Would the stop and frisk still happen? Rapper Immortal Technique tweets. And Brad writes, when we say the stop and frisk policy breaks down the bonds of trust between police and communities, this is what we mean. Well, a news site that promotes itself as a place for revolutionaries to plan spontaneous uprisings is our next lead. Uprisr.com calls for activists to post their disruptive ideas, which are then voted up or down. The site's creator says the aim is to have the best ideas rise to the top and grab the attention of activists. We'll monitor the site to see what happens. Lisa?
All right, well, stay with us because the post show is next. It's streamed at aljazeera.com. Now, on Thursday, is online censorship threatening to destroy Jordan's primary source of economic hope? It's going to be a surprising discussion because many observers have always looked to Jordan as an example of really freedom of speech, particularly on the internet. So send us your thoughts and your questions on that. And until then, we're going to leave you with a feminized version of that Super Bowl ad we started the show with.
I will prepare meals for you. I will prepare meals for your friends. I will clean the kitchen after preparing meals for you and your friends. I will give birth to your children. I will raise your children. And I will continue to do a majority of household chores by a factor of 3 to 1. I will be the prime breadwinner in a majority of households. I will still bring home only 80 cents on the dollar for doing the exact same job. I will start 70% of all new businesses. I will be responsible for making major financial decisions in 95% of U.S. households. And because I do this, I will stop payment on your gas-guzzling, ego-stroking macho-mobile.
All right, welcome back to the online post show with author Hanna Rosin. She is the author of The End of Men and the Rise of Women. It's an incredibly wonderful and controversial new book. Hanna, we've been talking about this idea of redefining masculinity. What role do women have in helping men do the redefining?
I had someone look at me and say, okay, your husband tomorrow, my husband who's the editor of a magazine, becomes a stay-at-home dad. How do you feel about him? Are you still attracted to him? You know, she was prodding me to think about all these questions. Like, are you in some ways putting that on men? Do women need men to be their protectors? Or, you know, do they rely on sort of the brawn or the old ideas of masculinity? So it's not so much that men are this way or that way. It's that we women and we society at large want and need men to be that way. So I think that was a really, really provocative question that I had to think about a lot. You know, what role do we play in keeping men in the box that we think they're in right now? And I think it served them well all these years. I mean, that's the other thing. There was patriarchal privilege. No matter how you were, there were also ways of making a lot of money and having a prosperous life, even if you didn't go to college, say. And I think those have dwindled because of the shifts in our economy and things like that. So I think it used to work okay, and now it works less well.
You mentioned patriarchal privilege, and Stephanie, there's a tweet here that picks up on that. Dilar says, I don't want the end of men. I want the end of patriarchy, and thus the beginning of more women in all aspects of life. What are your thoughts on that?
In the end of patriarchy, in terms of a system in which women, as they were less than 50 years ago, were legally required to apply for different jobs. It was perfectly legal to pay them lower wages. There were head and master laws that said the men had the final say on most financial decisions, that the man determined where the couple lived, so that if he moved away and she refused to join him, maybe she had aging parents that she wanted to take care of, he could actually charge her with desertion and win a fault-based divorce. That kind of patriarchy is dead. The remains of male dominance and the accumulated privilege, just as whites over the years got more wealth that it accumulated than blacks do, even the ones who earn the same income. The remains of male privilege remain and still need to be dismantled. And for all of us, it's a huge challenge, as Hanna said, about how to embrace the possibilities and gains of that equality and not undermine it by falling into old habits.
Along what lines in the United States did you see the most role reversal happening?
In the working class, which one of the callers mentioned, I mean, sometimes when I visit these towns, I feel like it's a world turned upside down. I mean, I feel like the women really are running families. They are, you know, there's a sense that women are in charge of things. And a lot of this means women are raising children alone, for example, which again is not a fantastic thing. But you sort of wonder what the role of them, literally what the role of men are in certain parts of society where they seem to have dropped out sort of as fathers and breadwinners. I mean, that's a very, very serious issue. And then something Stephanie writes about, I mean, if I talk about the marriages of the educated classes, there it's not so much a role reversal as it is more a back and forth equality. I talk about these seesaw marriages in which what's changed is that, you know, a woman can earn the money for some period of time and then a man can do it for another period of time. It's a little bit like the Obama marriage where, you know, Michelle Obama's a healthcare executive and then Barack Obama he's in law school. And so that's a big change, but I would say that's a positive change and looks more like equality or convergence than it looks like, you know, women taking over.
So I imagine on the book tour, though, you get a different response depending on what part of the country you're in when you're doing your talks.
Yes, a radically different response. I mean, I had a letter come to me from someone who said, you know, why are you going on and on about this, the end of this, the rise of this? I'm a stay-at-home dad. It's fabulous. Nobody says anything to me. And it turned out he was from the very liberal city of Portland, Oregon. Uh-huh. So I thought, right, exactly. Yes. And then, you know, I write about Alabama and the South, which is more traditional and religious and biblical. And I think there, these changes in relationships between men and women are, you know, heartbreaking for a lot of people. It's not what they biblically believe. It's not, you know, how they think that the natural order between men and women are. So that's I think, much harder adjustment.
Well, there's a slightly tongue-in-cheek tweet here from Derek Ashong, who's, of course, a former streamer. He says, men shouldn't worry. So long as women aren't allowed schooling or equal pay, we can totally compete. I'd like now to go to Google Plus because Noah has a follow-up question. Go ahead, Noah.
Yes, Ms. Rosin, I like where you're coming from. You're talking about changing economic roles as convergence and opening up of opportunities for different roles for men. But I don't feel like your writing reflects that rhetoric very well. In particular, your New York Times piece, "Who Wears the Pants in This Economy?" A collection of anecdotes. I've spoken with a couple of the sources there that didn't like how they were represented, but that's a side issue. The more important thing is you're framing these things as a negative. You're framing them as a loss, as an end. And then you come on this show and you're framing it as, like I say, an opening up of opportunity and exploration of new roles. How do you reconcile that? Because it feels very off to me.
It's just both. I mean, it's just both. It depends where you come from. It depends how old you are. I think it would be false to say that for most men, this is fabulous. I think that is absolutely not true. I think for a lot of men, it's very difficult and they're very ambivalent about it. And I think it would be false to say that for, the vast majority of men, this is a disaster. I think for many men that we talk to, it's great. I mean, it's like a lot of other things in this country. If you think about it as, there's this revolution, earthquake, these changes that are happening, people are going to react in very different ways to that. So, I don't think you can go to Alabama, to the town that I went to, and find a lot of guys there, except for the younger guys who say, been waiting for this all my life. I mean, you may be able to find that in a generation or two, but that's not certainly what's going on now. Whereas if you went to a different, more progressive coastal city, such as San Francisco or something like that, you'd probably find a lot more men who said, this is fantastic. We've been preparing for this most of our young lives, and I can't wait for it. So,
but you would find men in environments where it was more acceptable.
Yeah, where it was more acceptable, and a lot of it is about social sanction. Like if the community around you, thinks of a strict biblical order between men and women, of course it's going to be hard when this happens. But if the community around you, praises you when you, for example, do a lot of work with your children or cook at home or embrace these changing gender roles, then you're not going to get any social sanction, and it's going to be fabulous, and you're going to feel good. So it's as simple as that.
No, you got to admit that it can be tough for guys. I mean, when guys do start to take on these less traditional gender roles, there are a lot of men out there that give them a hard time about it.
Absolutely, and I'm not sure they need help from Ms. Rosen doing that. That's kind of my point, is that these are changing roles. These are opening up opportunities. And yes, that progress does create a disconnect in some cases, but that progress should be supported, not framed as a disaster.
Oh, I don't think you're...
No, I mean, the title is the problem. I mean, so you say the end of men, and so then you think it's a disaster, but you just have to read between the covers. What can I say? I mean, it's clearly not a disaster.
You seek out cases where people are feeling alienated and disconnected because that supports what you're selling.
But doesn't that reflect the thesis of the book?
Yeah, I'm not. I don't want it to be a disaster. I really don't. I think it's good for some people, and I think it's bad for other people. So that New York Times Magazine story was a particular set of couples in a particular town, which showed a particular change in America, but not necessarily represented the whole world.
Let's go back to Google Plus Hangout, where Stephanie Christina has a follow-up. Christina, go ahead.
Hello again, am I there? Yes. Well, I just wondered, I think one of the things you tend to underestimate is the price that's paid by women, the women who are getting a bit more power in this whole struggle, if you want to frame it in those terms. Most women I know who have jobs that are halfway rewarding are practically dying of exhaustion. They are juggling childcare, they are juggling housework, they are carrying by far the heavier weight in this whole burden. And it seems to me that that's underestimated, and prices are paid all round in all these power shifts. And I think for, as we discussed earlier, for working class men, these are very, very tough times for the men who don't have the social skills for the jobs which might be in call centres or whatever they might be that are replacing manufacturing. But I think we have a lot of groups of men and women who are really suffering with these changes, and the women who are getting bits of power are exhausted. And I really don't think you give very much credence to that side of the argument in the whole thing.
Hannah, you got about 20 seconds if you want to respond.
Oh, yes, I totally agree with that. I mean, I have a chapter in which women are making so much more money than their husbands, and even in those cases, they tend to do more of the housework. So I think I totally agree with that.
All right, our thanks to Hannah Rosen, Stephanie Coontz, and everyone in our Google Hangout for your participation in the show today. Catch up with us online or catch us tomorrow for AJ Stream.